Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Ground Rules Employment Law over your coffee break. My name is Pam Howland, and I'm here today with Jennifer Walrath and Doug Plass, two other attorneys in our office. And we have a special guest with us today, JJ Despain from Wilner O'Reilly. JJ is an immigration attorney, and we are super excited to have him with us today because he has a practice that is very different than ours. And over the course of the past few months, we've had a lot of moments where we've watched what's going on in the country and have thought, boy, we really need to bring someone in who's got expertise on some of these issues impacting employers that we don't have expertise in. So, JJ, thanks for joining us today.
Happy to be here, and happy St. Patrick's Day.
That's right. I know. Happy St. Patrick's Day. Everybody's got their green on today. So, I'd like to start just by having JJ tell us a little bit about his immigration practice and the types of things that he does. If you're here in Boise, Idaho, or I would say anywhere in Idaho, JJ could be a really good resource for you. So, JJ, tell us a little bit about what you do.
Sure. So I've been with Wilner O'Reilly for 9 years, and I started in Salt Lake, and but most of my career has been here in Boise. And we do anything and everything to do with immigration. So the way we sort of divide it up in our firm is what we call family-based first. So that's sort of like green cards for marriage or family petitions. And then we also include sort of humanitarian type visas, like visas for victims of crime or asylum cases. And then the other part is removal defense. So someone who finds themselves in immigration court, if there's any way to defend against that or slow it down at least, that's another area. And then the third one is employment based. And we also include not only employers sponsoring employees, but also entrepreneurs and investor visas. And then we also kind of include student visas with that as well, because often those student visas lead to something through employment. So those are the three departments, at least the way we organize it at our firm. I do a little bit of everything, mostly the family-based, but I have done a lot of employment-based cases, and I do really enjoy those. And so it's always nice to get to work on one of those.
Great. Well, let's jump in. We know that there are a lot of immigration issues stirring around out there, and we want to focus today somewhat on the ones that are impacting employers and areas where employers might have some questions. So, as we've moved into 2025, I know that you're tracking all these issues. What do you think are the most important things that employers should have on their minds when it comes to immigration issues?
Yeah, I mean, the ICE activity is definitely picking up. Here in Idaho, it won't be necessarily through mass efforts, just because we're a smaller state, but there aren't as many resources for ICE either. But I think they're going to be a little more creative in sort of their tactics and try things they haven't been trying for the past few years. Idaho's never been a sanctuary state, but I think they kind of, with the new administration, sort of feel like there's some more possibilities, some more options. And so there could be some unannounced raids, and we've already seen a little bit of that happening more this year. More audits with I-9s. So, I-9 compliance is going to be very important to prepare for any immigration action.
So, as we think through those issues a little bit, are there certain industries that you think are going to get hit harder? And you said you've seen a little activity around here. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably the industries that are more likely to have workers without authorization. So that probably means agricultural type work. It maybe it's kind of a strange irony, but a lot of the industries that are desperate for workers and are hiring foreign workers because there aren't enough American workers who are interested or available, those are also the ones that are more likely to be hit by ICE audits, ICE raids, because they know that they probably have some workers who are here without status, without employment authorization. And so, we see it a lot, agricultural type businesses, some construction companies, hotels and hospitality industries. So that's where I expect to see a lot more.
What do you think employers can do and should be doing now in anticipation just to take proactive measures against some type of I-9 audit or some type of raid?
Yeah, I mean, you can definitely do your own self audit, go through your online and your personnel files and just kind of see if everything's up to date there. And one thing I guess that's good to keep in mind is that just if employers find out that they have a worker who doesn't have a valid social security number or a valid work permit, that doesn't mean they need to take sort of drastic action. They don't need to fire or lay off that employee right away. There might be something else we can do. And that's sometimes the work I do as an employer says, hey, we got this letter from the Social Security office or from ICE. We aren't sure what to do. Those letters do not say fire that employee right away. It's always, look for another solution. And there might be one, even if it's not a quick solution, at least it's more than just cut out the problem. Especially if it's an employee you care about, there's probably going to be options available that aren't just to get rid of them.
Do you have employers who call you and say, hey, can you kind of walk me through best practices or do some kind of proactive? Is that part of what your practice is, or tell us a little bit about it?
I do a little bit of that. I think it's just good to kind of give that information to make sure there's no fear, or at least as little as possible. If you're prepared, you won't fear. So we kind of explained what it is that ICE is actually looking for when it comes to a workplace. That there are options. It's not the end of the world. It might be messy, but that's part of our case. We're not putting as much as possible.
And what should employers do if ICE does show up? Is there any advice that you want to give them when federal agents come knocking on the door?
Yeah, I mean, definitely try to be sort of accommodating as much as possible. It always makes it worse if you try to resist or fight back. And my style has always been to try to work within the system instead of try to tear down the system, just in general. Because usually we can kind of come to some sort of compromise or a good agreement that I think is more rewarding than just trying to fight everything inside. So, in general, I would say just sort of answer questions and be accommodating. And again, just because they show up doesn't mean that everything's shut down and that you lose all your employees. There are some sort of instructions they would give, some reports that you need to give back. Basically it's sort of like instructions to go through your IMAX, go through your personnel records. Usually when someone is actually picked up at work and arrested and detained is because they're already here without any kind of status, either they overstayed a visa or have never had a visa. For those, there might not be a whole lot to stop them because basically just being here without status is enough to get arrested. So you can't really, even without any sort of special warrant or anything, those people can be picked up. But that doesn't mean they're gone immediately. There's usually options to slow down the process, to negotiate with ICE, kind of do some sort of almost like a plea deal, like in a criminal case. There's some options there. The employer doesn't have to be too involved with that part of it, but that's definitely something we can help with.
I was just thinking as you're talking about, someone showing up at your door, that we do have a similar, I guess, process sometimes in employment law, like a Department of Labor auditor might show up at your door. And we've talked off and on about, kind of employers sitting down, making a plan of action, when that happens, if that happens, who does what, who do we call, what do we do? Is that something that would be helpful in this context as well, in your experience?
Yeah, I think so. Definitely. It's always better to kind of be familiar with it, talk with an immigration lawyer just to know what it's like and that it's, not so mysterious. Just kind of know what it is ICE is looking for. It's not usually as dramatic as something like you might see on TV. They are, busting doors down, that sort of thing. It's just a little more, there's more of a conversation. It's not necessarily unilateral. Like they kind of try to work together with you, and they are definitely driven by a certain thing that might be the opposite of your motivations. It might feel kind of like you're opponents, but not necessarily enemies. Is kind of how I look at it. And so, yeah, it's not the end of the world usually, but it is something to prepare for.
Do you see any type of advance notice, or is there any way to know before they show up that maybe that's coming? Have you seen any type of warning or flag before that?
Sometimes that happens. I think nowadays that will be less common. I think with ICE having this directive to do more and yet not having more resources to do more, I think that might be one of their tactics. Is we don't have time to prepare anything for it. We just need to go in there and get some things done. So, but yeah, there are sometimes letters that come, and a lot of it actually, even without involving ICE, is something from the Social Security Administration. That's where I get a lot of calls. Is, hey, I got this letter from the Social Security office. Am I in trouble? And usually the first letters say these Social Security numbers don't match like the real number, and but they give you some time to figure it out. Maybe it is just a simple error to fix. Maybe it is a person who has a fake Social Security number. But you have some ways to sort of figure it out before Social Security or ICE demands that you do something.
Is there a most common mistake that happens with the I-9s? Is it related to that, or what are some of the other?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen cases where I think I-9s is pretty easy for certain employers to kind of treat them like a hassle and just breeze through it. But then that's where mistakes get made. And like I've had clients who they so one thing that happens a lot, unfortunately, is if someone gets any sort of immigration benefit by fraud, and usually you think that is like using fake papers at the border, but it could also be that they got a job, filled in an I-9, and they marked the box next to citizen when they're not a citizen. That a lot of times it's the employer or the HR person or someone at the company marks these boxes. They just sort of assume or it don't matter that much, and so they sort of fill out the form for the employee and just have them sign it. The employee doesn't even know they're signing it. And I have had cases where they apply for a green card or something later on, and then the immigration officer says, well, we have here on this record that you said you were a citizen when you're not. And so it's from years before they got some job, they didn't even realize they signed that. And so I think being careful with the I-9 is not just checking boxes that help you out as a company, that are convenient for you, but making sure you're actually verifying, does this person have a Social Security card? Do they have the right identification, not just skip that part?
Well, I am curious on the employer side, if someone comes in and does an I-9 audit and there are issues found, kind of what can happen in those situations?
Yeah, I mean, usually the first remedy you could say is to lay off that employee, and that's usually what ICE will start with. Any employees that are not compliant, but then it could lead to fines, lead to other severe things for the company itself. But usually, in the experiences I've had, it's where the company sort of solves the problem by laying off the employee, but of course that causes new problems. It's especially on the employee that if it's an employee they care about, if it really changes the way the company runs by not having this person. Unfortunately, there are businesses that do kind of end up shutting down because of something like that. Even if they haven't actually had to pay any fines or necessarily receive any punishments, just sort of the other effects end up messing things up for them. Yeah.
So you mentioned fines. Do you have any sense of what the magnitude of those could be?
I don't really have a lot of experience with that as far as actual numbers or things like that, but yeah, it is sort of like an administrative process, kind of treat it like a fine, like you might have from the Department of Labor or something like that. And so, nothing criminal, at least for now. That might change later on. No actual sort of criminal penalty, but civil penalties for sure.
So switching gears a little bit, how about issues that maybe employers who have workers on visas or, not necessarily related to I-9 or audits? What other types of issues are floating around out there that employers should be thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, for the changes happening so far, like the type of visas that have been available still will be H-1Bs, L-1s. Those are probably the most common that employers deal with, or F-1 student visas. So those are still going to be around. I haven't seen any real changes yet, but I'm sure there will be some coming. I do expect that USCIS, so they're part of Homeland Security, Citizenship and Immigration Services. That's usually the agency I deal with because that's where we are asking immigration for something, not defending against something they're doing to us. So when we're asking for like a visa or work permit, they will likely get a little pickier when it comes to how much evidence you have, how strictly you follow the rules and qualifications. So often an employer will get a request for evidence. So it's sort of like a letter saying, we can't prove your case yet, but here's what we need to make a decision. And those will probably be more common, more intense. The first thing I do when I get an RFP in the mail is see how many pages long it is. And that tells me, if it's an 8 or 9 page letter, but it's asking for more evidence for everything. And so even if you have a lot of evidence to show that this person qualifies for H-1B or whatever visa sponsoring, just be ready to come up with more. This will probably, need to be ready for someone to be picky. And so, I kind of see it as not a lot of actual rules changing on that front, but just how they're enforced and how strict, how picky they are with those rules. And by that I mean things like, for H-1B, those visas are basically for a job that is related to what the person has a bachelor's or master's degree in. And you might want to be careful to make sure it's not too loose in connection. Kind of have more detailed job descriptions, job duties that actually match what that person's degree is in. That's the sort of thing I think USCIS will be looking for is, this person has a degree in computer science. You hired them as a software developer. Does that really coincide? And the arguments that it does, but you want to be ready. You sort of want to be ready to show things, even if you think it's obvious, just be ready to explain to someone who does not think it's obvious. Because that's basically what USCIS's job is. It's to sort of second guess everything. And there's probably going to be a lot more of that in the coming years.
Is that impacting employers on a local level, like with their ability to retain, I guess, or to hire labor? Like, do you think it's making it tougher for employers to find the people that they need to get to fill jobs?
And that combined with the economy and the Great Resignation, all of that combined is we do get more employers who maybe have never had to worry about immigration before, but now they're like, we can't find enough workers. We need to hire foreign workers, and we don't know how to do that. And we don't want to mess up. We don't want to do the wrong thing, and then or they think they can do it on their own, and then get messed up after that. And so, I think there is sort of hesitation, but I don't think there's any reason to not get started on the process for any employer that either has a foreign employee or is thinking about hiring from outside of the U.S. And that's our job is to help them figure it out. And there are still ways to do it. It's not anything that the hiring part shouldn't be something that anyone's scared of.
How about other things we haven't touched on? Are you seeing I know there's a lot, but other big immigration shifts or changes, or, I know we're watching the news and it seems like on a daily basis, there's something impacting immigration on the news. What other types of things should employers be on the lookout for?
Yeah, well, there is, a lot of sort of overlap with what people kind of think of with law and criminal law in particular. So, I think of cases where, in criminal law, you might be able to question whether this person can actually be arrested, but in immigration, there's a lot less of that. It's just someone being without status isn't enough to be arrested. So, there's fewer protections when you think of what we're used to as U.S. citizens. The there has to be more action from ICE, even locally. It used to be I would get people who ask, well, what happens if ICE knocks on the door? And now it turns into, ICE came to my cousin's house, or ICE came to my coworker's house, and so it's hitting closer to home. So there's definitely not just theoretical; it's more this is actually happening. I'm seeing it happening. How do I get ready for it? And there's not a whole lot to prevent it if you're here without status, but I think having some kind of case processing, even if it's not necessarily for permanent status, I think that's sort of some unofficial protection. So, for example, if someone has a family member who is a U.S. citizen, they can do a petition for them that theoretically could help them eventually become a permanent resident. But there might be a lot of obstacles before you get to the permanent residency part, but at least having the petitioning processing, I think is good, and you can show proof that it basically is a way of saying, I don't have status, but I'm working on it. And that sometimes can show ICE you're not a priority, you're already in touch with a lawyer, maybe you already are in the system, and that can help. And so, yeah, definitely through family is a good way to do that. There's also just being kind of detail oriented as far as what the processes are. For example, USCIS not too long ago, they changed the edition date on some of their forms. The form itself did not really change very much. They just sort of updated it, put a new date on it, and said, if you send us the old form, we're going to reject it. And they did this without any kind of warning, which they usually have kind of an overlap kind of experience where you can do the old forms a little bit as you get ready for the new form. But that kind of tactic, I think, was just to try to mess people up, or just to try to whittle or weed out some of those applications, because people are going to be rejected without knowing why. Luckily, there was a lawsuit that kind of put that to a halt, so now there is sort of a grace period. But there's things those sort of sneaky tactics, I think, more where you think you're following the rules, but then they change it on you. And so that's definitely a good thing to have an attorney force who's paying attention to this every day to prevent these kind of issues from happening.
So you talked about employees maybe getting some type of case processing going. How about for employers? Before the podcast started, we were talking a little bit about there are things employers can do if they want to take a proactive approach to helping employees, maybe?
Yeah. So unfortunately, if someone is here without immigration status, either because they overstayed a visa or never had a visa in the first place, there's not a whole lot an employer can do directly. They can do a petition, but they won't really get them anywhere because there's that unlawful presence or maybe a prior deportation or something like that, that there's not really a way to waive that through an employer. But what an employer can do sort of indirectly is just have their employee talk to an immigration lawyer, because maybe there's something with that employee's family that can help. If it turns out the employee is going to be a U.S. citizen, that opens up a lot of doors. I don't know if employers should be arranging marriages, but they should. They can say, hey, maybe through your family, also through humanitarian options. So there's a couple of things that people maybe aren't even aware exist. One is a U visa and one is a T visa. The U visa is for people who are victims of violent crimes in the United States. And that's the sort of thing an employer probably won't know, that, the employees keep that confidential. They probably won't tell their boss that they were assaulted and had to call the police. But they should tell an attorney, and so the employer might be able to say, hey, I set up a consultation with this immigration attorney, you can talk to him, and then it's more confidential, and there might be something personal like that, like being a victim of crime, being a victim of domestic violence. A T visa is, it's called a visa for victims of human trafficking, but it can include other things besides what we imagine when we think of trafficking. So, I've had cases where someone came into the U.S. kind of under false pretenses, thinking they were going to get hired to do a job. It turned out to be this fraud and a lie, or they do work that aren't paid or aren't in really bad work conditions. That could be a similar visa where someone was a victim of something, and a current employer might not necessarily know that, but that's part of an immigration firm's job, is to find out, like, maybe there's some sort of underlying basis that can be the way of a visa. What's nice about some of those visas is that they can waive a lot of things, like an unlawful presence, like other issues of immigration prior. And so it might be a way to keep an employee on or help an employee get permanent status here eventually, even if you aren't actually sponsoring them, but you're the one as the employer kind of connecting them with those legal resources to work on their own case.
Yeah, that makes sense. One last question. So, one of our more recent podcasts was on the very exciting topic of handbook policies. we're, we're big on reinforcing how key it is to have the right policies in place before you have a problem come up. Are there, like off the top of your head, are there policies employers should be implementing related to these type of issues?
Yeah, I mean, just kind of things we talked about before, just making sure that the people who are doing the I-9 forms are trained and up to date on that, that they aren't just filling out the forms in a way that sort of helps out the company, but kind of think about what can prevent issues from happening. Because it is probably easier, as hard as it might be, it's probably easier to let an employee know before they're actually an employee. Sorry, it doesn't seem like you have the right work authorization, right status for us to hire you. And then, I think the I-9 is good. The E-Verify system is also a related thing, just to kind of make sure that people have the right ID numbers, that they match something already in the system. So those are going to be good resources. And then I think also kind of along those lines too, if someone doesn't clear through the system, either there's some sort of discrepancy, that doesn't necessarily mean the employer has to give up or fire or lay off that employee. They can sort of have some contingency plans to get say, which might be to contact me or another immigration lawyer just to flip out that sort of thing. Of course, a lot of employers have their own HR person or sort of an in-house counsel that may deal with a lot of things, but immigration is one of those things that might be kind of outside their wheelhouse, so it's good to refer that out and not just try to learn on the fly, because that usually it messes things up more, and then it's more of a mess for me to clean up later on.
Yes, we can relate to that too. Always better to get the call in on the front end than on the back end. So maybe for newer businesses or smaller employers, how does E-Verify work? Who uses that as a resource and what does that do for I-9?
Yeah, it's basically a way to check immigration files on whether this person has a work permit or not, whether they have a social security number. One thing I'll mention is social security number. Once you get one, it's good forever, even if you lose your immigration status. So, for example, and this might be a good thing to think about with I-9s as well, is that, for example, if someone comes in as a student with a student visa, they get a social security number through that. If they overstay the student visa, they no longer have work authorization, but their social security number is still good. So that could be something where maybe you do E-Verify one of these checks, and it's like, oh, social security number is good, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're allowed to work in the United States. So there's a difference between a work permit and a social security number. So E-Verify can help with that sort of thing. We see it a lot actually with the DMV. We'll get clients who say, I've tried to renew my driver's license, they gave me this letter. It says they have to verify, and usually it's something like maybe they got a driver's license back when they had a work permit, and 10 years later it's time to renew the license, they don't have a work permit anymore, and that's why they have to do some extra checks. Every state's different when it comes to driver's licenses, so that's definitely something that comes up where, and related to employers, any employees who need to drive for their jobs and depend on having a driver's license, that's something else where the employer might think everything's fine, and then their employee all of a sudden doesn't have a driver's license anymore, and that could be something else to check on. And E-Verify helps with those sorts of things.
Great. Well, JJ, that has been super helpful. I know I learned a ton and have a better idea of some things to be thinking about and instances where we should be directing employers to pick up the phone and give you a call.
Yeah, for sure. And so I'm local here in Boise. I'm actually just a couple blocks away from you guys. But we can do work from all over. I mean, immigration, since it's federal law, every state's a little bit different with certain things, but when it comes to I-9s, ICE, USCIS, Department of Labor, it's all at a federal level. So yeah, We have cases from all over the country. I'm here in Boise. We have offices in Salt Lake City and Phoenix, Arizona, and then Sacramento and Orange and San Diego and Fresno, our main offices in California. So, we give us a call, and we have. There's 2 attorneys here in Boise, but there's about 20 total in all of our offices. So we have kind of a touch with a small firm, but also the resources of the big firm. If there's something I had experience with or I don't know the answer to, there's definitely a lawyer who has. We're a good place to call. Any employer, any size. I think a lot of smaller companies handle immigration's too big of a hassle that we can't afford it, but we can help small businesses too. It's better to have that information be prepared than prevent a lot of that fear, a lot of that uncertainty.
Yeah, and I'm connected with JJ on LinkedIn, and I know you have some good resources you funnel out through LinkedIn too. So that's another way to get some good info and to learn more about JJ's practice.
Yeah, our firm's pretty good on social media, just getting the word out there. And if something comes up in the news, we'll do a video about it, to make sure people know. And I've done a few of those. Follow us on social media. Even if you don't actually schedule a consultation, you'll still get a lot of good information out there too.
Perfect. Okay, well, that's it for today on Ground Rules. We'll see you next time and hope everybody out there has a happy St. Paddy's Day.
Ground Rules hosts and guests are not providing legal advice in this podcast. Do not act upon any of the information discussed in this podcast without first consulting a licensed attorney in your jurisdiction.